Sarah's hands trembled as she guided the drone back toward her position, the controller slick with perspiration despite the October chill. The creature's gaze had followed the aircraft's movement with an intelligence that sent ice through her veins, not the curious tracking of a bear or the territorial assessment of a wolf, but something calculating, deliberate. She forced herself to breathe steadily, her scientific training warring with primal fear. 23 years of fieldwork had taught her to trust her observations, even when they challenged conventional wisdom. But this shattered the very foundations of what she thought she knew about the natural world. The drone's battery indicator flashed yellow, 15 minutes of flight time remaining. Sarah fought the urge to bring it home immediately, instead directing it in a wider circle around the settlement. If these were the last moments she'd have to document this discovery, she needed every frame to count. Through the camera's lens, she counted at least a dozen structures arranged in what appeared to be deliberate clusters. The constructions weren't crude lean-tos or random assemblages of branches. They showed architectural planning, elevated foundations to prevent moisture damage, angled roofs for rain runoff, strategic positioning that suggested understanding of wind patterns and solar exposure. A movement caught her attention. 3 of the bipedal figures emerged from the largest structure, their gait unmistakably coordinated. The lead creature, larger than the others, with darker fur streaked with silver, carried what looked like a tool. Not a found stick or convenient rock, but something crafted, shaped. Sarah's breath caught. The implications crashed over her like a landslide. Tool creation suggested cognitive development beyond anything documented in non-human species. It implied abstract thinking, planning, cultural transmission of knowledge. It meant intelligence. The silver-streaked leader gestured to the others, pointing in different directions. They dispersed with military precision, each taking predetermined paths through the settlement. Sarah watched one approach what she'd initially mistaken for random undergrowth, but now recognized as organized agriculture. Rows of plants in various stages of cultivation, protected by carefully woven barriers. Her academic mind catalogued the evidence while her gut churned with growing unease. Organized settlements, tool use, agriculture, communication, social hierarchy. Every marker anthropologists use to define civilization was displayed in the footage streaming across her tablet screen. The drone's altitude alarm chimed softly. She'd unconsciously lowered it for a better view, dropping to just under 200 feet, close enough to make out individual details that made her skin crawl. Close enough to see the intelligence burning in their eyes when they occasionally glanced skyward. Too close. Sarah pulled the drone higher, but something in the creature's behavior had shifted. The casual efficiency of their movements was replaced by subtle alertness. Heads turned more frequently toward the sky. The one with the tool had stopped its work entirely, standing motionless in a way that reminded her of predators listening for prey. They knew they were being watched, had probably known from the moment her drone entered their airspace. The battery indicator flashed red. 10 minutes remaining, maybe less in the cold mountain air. Sarah began the return journey, her mind racing faster than the drone's rotors. She had footage of what appeared to be an undiscovered species exhibiting signs of advanced intelligence and social organization. It was the kind of discovery that should launch her into scientific immortality. So why did every instinct scream that she was in terrible danger? As the drone cleared the canopy and climbed toward her position on the ridge, Sarah allowed herself one last look at the settlement through the camera. The creatures had gathered in the central clearing, at least 20 of them now visible. They stood in formation, all facing the same direction, all facing her. Even from this distance, even through the digital eye of the drone, she could feel the weight of their collective attention. It pressed against her consciousness like a physical force, alien and overwhelming. These weren't animals reacting to a novel stimulus. This was organized response to surveillance. The drone's approach alarm buzzed. Sarah looked up from the screen to see the aircraft descending toward the small clearing where she'd established her observation post. Her hands moved automatically through the landing sequence while her mind struggled to process what she'd witnessed. The footage was safe, stored on both the drone's internal memory and the tablet's hard drive. She had documentation of the impossible. But as she caught the drone and powered down its systems, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that documenting them was exactly what they'd wanted her to do. The forest around her seemed different now, charged with hidden purpose. Every shadow could conceal watchers. Every sound might carry meaning beyond her understanding. The morning mist that had seemed merely atmospheric an hour ago now felt like concealment, hiding movements just beyond her perception. Sarah packed her equipment with practiced efficiency, but her eyes kept returning to the tree line. Somewhere in the vast wilderness below, beings that shouldn't exist were going about their daily lives in ways that challenged everything she'd believed, about evolution, about intelligence, about humanity's place in the natural order, and now they knew someone was watching. Sarah's hands shook as she secured the drone in its foam-lined case, muscle memory from decades of fieldwork the only thing keeping her functioning. The equipment that had been an extension of her scientific curiosity an hour ago now felt like evidence of something she wasn't sure she was meant to survive discovering. The hike back to her truck took 40 minutes through terrain that seemed to shift with each step. Every snapped twig, every rustle of wind through the Douglas firs made her freeze and scan the shadows. The rational part of her mind, the part that had earned tenure at the University of Washington, that had published 37 peer-reviewed papers on predator behavior, insisted she was experiencing a normal adrenaline response to an extraordinary discovery. The primitive part, the part that had kept her ancestors alive in dark forests just like this one, whispered that something was following her. Her Ford F-150 sat exactly where she'd left it at the trailhead, coated in morning dew and looking impossibly ordinary. Sarah loaded her gear with practiced efficiency, but her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging exit routes and scanning for movement. 23 years of studying apex predators had taught her that the most dangerous moment was often when you thought you were safe. The drive down the winding mountain road should have calmed her nerves. Instead, the familiar ritual of checking mirrors, navigating switchbacks, and monitoring the truck's temperature gauge felt surreal after what she'd witnessed. How was she supposed to return to the mundane world of grant applications and faculty meetings when she carried footage that could rewrite evolutionary biology? Her phone buzzed against the dashboard mount. Marcus Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, her research partner and the closest thing she had to family since her divorce 5 years ago. She almost didn't answer, unsure how to explain what had happened without sounding insane. "Sarah, you're cutting out. Where are you?" "Mountain roads," she managed, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. "Heading back from the Cascade survey. Find anything interesting? Besides hypothermia and deer ticks?" The question hung in the air while Sarah watched the tree line blur past her window. What was the protocol for discovering an unknown intelligent species? Who did you call? The university? The National Science Foundation? The fucking military? "Sarah? Sorry. Bad connection. Just the usual elk sign. I'll have the full report Monday." "Okay. But don't forget the department mixer tonight. Patricia's been asking about your research, and you know how she gets when she thinks someone's avoiding her." The department mixer. Sarah had completely forgotten about the monthly gathering where faculty pretended to enjoy each other's company while jockeying for funding and recognition. The thought of making small talk about research methodology while carrying footage of beings that might predate human civilization made her stomach clench. "I'll be there," she lied. "Good. And Sarah, you sound weird. Everything okay?" Marcus had known her for 8 years, had been her anchor through the divorce, through her mother's death, through every crisis that had shaped her into the solitary woman she'd become. He could read her moods better than she could sometimes, just tired. Long morning in the field. After she hung up, the silence in the truck felt oppressive. Sarah reached for the radio, then stopped. Even the familiar comfort of NPR's weekend programming seemed trivial now. How could she listen to discussions about politics or economics when she'd just witnessed evidence that humanity might not be alone at the top of the evolutionary ladder? Her house in Bellingham sat nestled between towering evergreens, a 1970s ranch she'd bought after the divorce because it offered privacy and easy access to research sites. It had been her sanctuary, the place where she could retreat from university politics and failed relationships to focus on work that mattered. Now, pulling into her gravel driveway, it looked vulnerable. Too isolated, too surrounded by shadows that could hide anything. Sarah carried her equipment inside, setting the drone case on her dining room table with reverential care. The footage was still there, still real. In the safety of her home office, surrounded by 2 decades worth of research notes and wildlife photographs, she could begin to process what she'd discovered. But as she booted up her computer and prepared to transfer the files, doubt crept in. Her career had been built on methodical observation, on peer review, on the slow accumulation of knowledge that advanced human understanding. What she'd captured wasn't just a new species. It was proof that everything anthropologists and biologists thought they knew about intelligence and civilization was incomplete. The implications terrified her almost as much as the memory of those eyes, watching her from the forest floor with calculating awareness. Sarah's finger hovered over the play button that would let her review the footage. Once she started analyzing what she'd captured, once she began the process of documentation and verification, there would be no going back. Her ordinary world of research grants and faculty meetings would end, replaced by something she couldn't yet comprehend. But the alternative, pretending she'd seen nothing, deleting the files, returning to her safe academic existence, felt like betrayal. She pressed play. The first frame froze Sarah's blood. In the stark clarity of her home monitor, larger and more detailed than the drone's tablet display, the settlement wasn't just organized, it was ancient. Weathered stone foundations emerged from beneath what she'd assumed were natural root systems. Carved symbols marked the larger structures, worn smooth by decades or perhaps centuries of exposure. This wasn't a recent development in cryptid evolution. This was established civilization. Sarah paused the footage, her coffee growing cold as she stared at markings that predated any known indigenous settlements in the region. The academic in her thrilled at the implications while something deeper, more primal, recoiled from what she was seeing. Her landline rang, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Dr. Chen? This is Agent Patricia Voss with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. I understand you were conducting aerial surveys in the Cascade National Forest this morning." Sarah's hand tightened on the receiver. She'd filed her research permits weeks ago, standard protocol for drone operations in protected areas. But something in the woman's tone suggested this wasn't a routine check-in. "That's correct. Elk migration patterns, all properly documented." "I'm sure it is. Dr. Chen, we've received some interesting reports from hikers in your research area, sightings of unusual wildlife behavior. Given your expertise with apex predators, we'd appreciate your professional assessment." The words sounded reasonable, even collegial, but Sarah's years studying predator behavior had taught her to listen for what wasn't being said. Agent Voss knew something. The question was how much. "I'd be happy to review any documentation," Sarah said carefully. "Though I should mention my survey was focused on elk herds. I didn't observe any unusual predator activity." "Of course. Still, we'd like to schedule a brief interview. This afternoon, if possible. There are some inconsistencies in the reports that your expertise could help clarify." Sarah's eyes remained locked on her monitor, where a tool-wielding creature stood frozen mid-gesture. "I'm afraid I have commitments this weekend. Perhaps we could arrange something for Monday?" "I'm sorry, Dr. Chen, but this matter requires immediate attention. We're particularly interested in any aerial footage you may have captured. For wildlife assessment purposes, you understand." The pretense of courtesy had evaporated. "This wasn't a request. Agent Voss, I'm not sure I understand the urgency. We'll be at your residence within the hour. Please have all research materials available for review." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her mind racing. Government agents didn't mobilize on weekends for elk surveys. They didn't track down individual researchers unless something significant had triggered their attention. Either someone else had spotted the settlement, or worse, her drone hadn't been as undetected as she'd assumed. 57 minutes. That's how long she had before everything changed. Sarah turned back to the monitor and hit play, fast-forwarding through footage while her hands automatically copied files to multiple drives. 23 years of fieldwork had taught her the value of redundant data storage, but she'd never imagined needing it to protect evidence from her own government. The creatures moved through their daily routines with practiced efficiency. She watched them tend crops, manufacture tools, engage in what appeared to be educational activities with their young. The social complexity was staggering and terrifying. These beings weren't primitive holdovers from some evolutionary branch. They were sophisticated, organized, and had clearly been hiding their existence for generations. But why reveal themselves now? Why allow her drone to capture this footage? A new possibility crystallized, one that made her stomach drop. What if her discovery wasn't accidental? What if they'd wanted to be found? Sarah's doorbell rang. She glanced at her watch. 32 minutes early. Through her front window, she could see a black SUV in her driveway and two figures in dark suits approaching her door. Everything about the scene screamed federal authority, from their coordinated movement to the way one agent positioned himself to observe the street while the other approached. The footage was still playing, showing increasingly detailed views of the settlement. Sarah's finger hovered over the delete key. She could claim equipment malfunction, corrupted files, anything to avoid handing over proof of what existed in those remote valleys. Return to her safe academic existence and pretend the morning had never happened. But as she watched the creatures on her screen, teaching their young, tending their crops, building something that looked suspiciously like art, she knew destruction wasn't an option. Whatever these beings represented, whatever threat or wonder they posed to humanity's understanding of itself, they deserved more than erasure born from fear. The doorbell rang again, followed by authoritative knocking. "Dr. Chen." "We know you're inside." Sarah ejected the drives, slipping the primary into her jacket pocket while hiding the backup behind a row of research journals. She closed the laptop and walked to her front door, each step carrying her further from the ordinary world she'd known that morning. Her hand paused on the deadbolt. Once she opened this door, there would be no return to ignorance, no retreat into comfortable academic routine. She turned the lock and faced whatever came next. The door swung open to reveal two agents who looked like they'd stepped from a government handbook on intimidation. The woman matched the voice from the phone, Agent Voss, tall and sharp-featured with eyes that missed nothing. Her partner, a broad-shouldered man with prematurely grey hair, stood slightly behind her, his attention divided between Sarah and the street beyond. "Dr. Chen, thank you for your cooperation." Voss stepped forward without waiting for an invitation. "I'm Agent Voss, and this is Agent Martinez." "May we come in?" Sarah's throat felt dry as sawdust. Of course. They moved through her home with practiced efficiency, Martinez positioning himself near the front window, while Voss surveyed the living room. Sarah caught her gaze lingering on the dining table where the drone case sat, innocent as a briefcase but suddenly feeling radioactive. "Coffee?" Sarah offered, needing something to do with her hands. "This won't take long," Voss replied, producing a tablet from her jacket. "We understand you conducted aerial surveys in Sector 7G of the Cascade National Forest this morning. Can you confirm your flight path?" The question sounded routine, but Sarah's years studying predator behavior had taught her to recognize hunting patterns. These agents weren't here for elk migration data. They were here because someone or something had reported her presence. "Standard grid pattern over the Thornfield Valley," Sarah said, grateful her voice remained steady. "I can provide GPS coordinates if needed. That would be helpful." "And the nature of your survey?" "Elk herd tracking, population dynamics and migration route analysis." The lies came easily, wrapped in enough truth to sound credible. "It's part of a longitudinal study I've been conducting for the past 3 years. Voss made notes on her tablet, while Martinez moved through the house with casual thoroughness. Sarah fought the urge to follow him, knowing it would only draw attention to areas she wanted to protect. Instead, she maintained eye contact with Voss, projecting the confidence of someone with nothing to hide. But inside, her mind was fragmenting. The rational part that had built her career screamed at her to cooperate, to hand over the footage and let the professionals handle whatever was hiding in those forests. The academic part thrilled at the possibility of collaboration, of resources beyond her wildest dreams to study what she'd discovered. It was the primitive part, the part that had recognized intelligence burning in those inhuman eyes, that kept her silent. Dr. Chen, during your survey, did you observe any unusual wildlife behavior? Anything that seemed out of place for the region? The weight of the drives in her jacket felt enormous. Sarah thought of the creatures tending their crops, teaching their young, creating art, beings who had hidden their existence for generations, maintaining the careful illusion that humanity sat alone at the apex of intelligence. Nothing unusual, she heard herself say. Some displacement patterns that might indicate predator activity, but nothing outside normal parameters. Voss studied her with unsettling intensity. You're certain? We've received reports of anomalous sightings in that area. Given your expertise with apex predators, you'd be the ideal person to identify unusual behavior patterns. What kind of anomalous sightings? Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Hikers reported seeing large, bipedal figures moving through the forest. Coordinated movement suggesting pack behavior in species not known for such organization. Voss leaned forward slightly. The descriptions were unusual enough to warrant investigation. Sarah's stomach clenched. Other people had seen them. The secret that had hidden for centuries was unraveling, and she sat at the center of it with proof burning a hole in her pocket. Misidentification, most likely, she managed. Bear behavior can appear bipedal at distance, especially when feeding, trick of perspective and poor visibility. Perhaps. Voss made another note. Still, we'd appreciate reviewing any footage you captured. Even if it shows nothing unusual, it might help us establish baseline behavior patterns for the area. This was it. The moment when Sarah had to choose between the safe path of cooperation and the terrifying unknown of resistance. She thought of her career, her comfortable life, her reputation built over decades of careful research. All of it could disappear with a word. But she also thought of the settlement, of beings who had trusted the forest to keep their secrets, of intelligence that predated human civilization, surviving in shadows while humanity convinced itself it ruled the world. I'm afraid there was a technical malfunction, Sarah said, the words feeling like stepping off a cliff. Corrupted storage, file system failure. I lost most of the morning's data. The silence stretched between them like a wire under tension. Voss's expression never changed, but something shifted in her posture, the subtle alertness of a predator recognizing prey that might fight back. How unfortunate, Voss said finally. Equipment failure can be so inconvenient. Perhaps we could examine the device? Our technical team might be able to recover the corrupted files. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously toward her jacket pocket, where the drives felt heavy as stones. Of course. Though I should warn you, the corruption was severe. Complete data loss. She was committed now, standing on the far side of a line she couldn't uncross. Whatever came next, there would be no return to the ordinary world she'd known this morning. Voss's smile was razor-thin, the expression of someone accustomed to hearing lies. Dr. Chen, in my experience, complete data corruption is remarkably rare with modern storage systems. Almost convenient, one might say. The temperature in Sarah's living room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Through the window, she noticed a second black SUV had arrived, parking across the street with practiced discretion. This wasn't just a routine interview anymore. It was a containment operation. Technology fails, Sarah said, forcing herself to meet Voss's gaze. Anyone who's spent time in the field knows that equipment breaks down at the worst possible moments. Martinez appeared from the hallway, catching Voss's eye with an almost imperceptible shake of his head. They'd found nothing in their search, but Sarah caught the flash of frustration that crossed the lead agent's features. These people had expected to find evidence. They knew what she'd captured, which meant someone, or something, had reported her presence in that valley. Dr. Chen, Voss continued, her voice taking on a harder edge, let me be frank. We have satellite imagery showing your drone making extended circuits over an area of particular interest to national security. We have witness reports of anomalous activity in the same region, and now we have a wildlife biologist claiming total equipment failure at precisely the moment when cooperation would be most valuable. Sarah's mind raced. Satellite imagery meant this operation had resources she couldn't comprehend, the kind of funding that came from the highest levels of government, the sort deployed when something threatened, the fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. What exactly are you suggesting? Sarah asked, though she knew the question was pointless. They were past the stage of polite fiction. I'm suggesting that perhaps your memory might be clearer than your equipment's performance. Voss leaned back in her chair, a predator settling in for a long hunt. Sometimes traumatic events can cloud judgment, cause people to make impulsive decisions they later regret. The threat wasn't subtle. Sarah thought of her tenure, her research grants, the comfortable life she'd built through decades of careful academic navigation. All of it could vanish with a phone call, her career reduced to cautionary tale whispered in faculty lounges. But the drives in her pocket represented something larger than personal security. Evidence of intelligence that had thrived in secrecy while humanity congratulated itself on its dominance. Beings who had maintained the most successful concealment in the history of the planet, now exposed because she'd flown a drone over their home. Agent Voss, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. I've told you what happened. Equipment failure. If you have questions about wildlife behavior in the region, I'm happy to consult based on my general knowledge of the area, but I can't provide data that doesn't exist. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Sarah could sense forces gathering around her, decisions being made in rooms she'd never see by people whose names she'd never know. Whatever protection her academic credentials had once provided was evaporating like morning mist. Voss stood abruptly, Martinez following her lead with military precision. Dr. Chen, this conversation isn't over. We'll be in touch very soon with follow-up questions. In the meantime, I strongly advise against any additional research in the Cascade region. For your own safety, of course. Of course, Sarah echoed, walking them to the door on unsteady legs. As the agents reached their SUV, Voss turned back. Dr. Chen? Sometimes cooperation early in an investigation can prevent complications later. I hope you'll remember that. Sarah watched the vehicles disappear down her street, taking with them any illusion of normalcy. She was committed now to a path she couldn't see, protecting secrets that might reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the world. Inside her house, she pulled out the drives with shaking hands. The footage remained intact, proof of intelligence that had trusted the forest to keep its secrets. But that trust had been broken, and Sarah found herself holding evidence that could either advance human knowledge or destroy a civilization that had thrived in shadows. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, still planning to make the mixer tonight. Patricia's been asking about you. The department mixer. Faculty gathering around cheap wine and university politics, while she carried proof that everything they taught about human evolution was incomplete. The absurdity almost made her laugh. She typed back, "Something's come up. Rain check?" Sarah stared at the drives, knowing that whatever came next would define not just her future, but potentially the future of two species who had shared this continent in carefully maintained ignorance of each other. The comfortable world of academic routine was gone forever, replaced by something vast and unknowable. She was across the threshold now, standing in territory that had no maps. There was no going back. The drives felt like they were burning through her jacket pocket as Sarah stood in her empty living room, the silence oppressive after the agent's departure. She moved to the window and watched the street with new eyes, noting how the white sedan 2 houses down had been there all morning, how the jogger had passed her house 3 times in the last hour. Her world had shifted into something resembling a spy thriller, except the stakes were real and she had no training for the game she'd stumbled into. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. Sarah's blood chilled when she saw the sender no-dash reply at university-admin.edu. Dr. Chen, please report to the Dean's office Monday morning at 8 a.m. for urgent discussion regarding your research authorization and tenure review. Failure to appear may result in immediate suspension of all university privileges, administrative services. They were moving faster than she'd expected. Sarah stared at the terse message, recognizing the administrative language that preceded career destruction. 23 years of research, of building her reputation one careful publication at a time, and it could all disappear by Tuesday. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Dr. Chen? The voice was gravelly, older, with the careful diction of someone accustomed to being listened to. My name is David Kellerman. I believe we need to talk. I'm not interested in speaking with any more federal agents today. A dry chuckle. I'm retired from that particular profession. Have been for 15 years. But I know what you found up there. And more importantly, I know what finding it means for your future. Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? Dr. Chen, right now you're asking yourself whether you can trust the voice of a stranger, whether this is some elaborate trap designed to flush out evidence you may or may not possess. The answer is that you can't trust me. Not yet. But you can trust that the people who visited you today represent forces far larger than academic politics or even national security. You've stumbled onto something that threatens the fundamental balance of power on this continent. Through her window, Sarah watched another jogger pass. Different person, same route as the previous one. What do you want? To help you survive the next 72 hours. After that, you'll know enough to make informed decisions about what comes next. There's a coffee shop called Meridian Books on Pine Street. 20 minutes. Come alone, and doctor, bring your proof. All of it. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. David Kellerman could be anyone, another government operative, a conspiracy theorist, someone genuinely trying to help. But what choice did she have? The university was moving against her tenure, federal agents were watching her house, and she possessed evidence that could reshape human understanding of the world. Sarah grabbed her jacket, checking that the drives were secure, and headed for her car. As she backed out of her driveway, she noticed the white sedan pulling away from the curb 2 houses down, not even trying to be subtle anymore. Meridian Books occupied a narrow storefront between a vintage clothing shop and a Thai restaurant, the kind of place that served overpriced coffee to graduate students and adjunct professors living on hope and caffeine. Sarah found a parking spot 3 blocks away, taking a circuitous route that led her past shop windows where she could check for surveillance. The sedan was gone, but that didn't mean she wasn't being watched. Inside the bookshop, she spotted him immediately. Late 60s, silver-haired, wearing a worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. He sat in the back corner nursing black coffee and reading what appeared to be a field guide to Pacific Northwest flora. Everything about him suggested careful preparation and long experience with clandestine meetings. Sarah approached his table, every instinct screaming that she was making a catastrophic mistake. Mr. Kellerman? He looked up with pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance. Dr. Chen. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. We don't have much time before your new friends realize you've left the house. Sarah remained standing. How do I know you're not working with them? Because if I were, you'd already be in a windowless room answering much less pleasant questions. Kellerman gestured to the chair across from him. I spent 28 years with various 3-letter agencies, Dr. Chen. The last 7 were devoted to a project called Deep Forest. Our mandate was investigating reports of anomalous wildlife activity in remote wilderness areas. And we found things that challenged every assumption about intelligence, evolution, and humanity's place in the natural order. Things that certain people decided were too dangerous for public knowledge. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You're not the first researcher to capture footage of their settlements, Dr. Chen, but you might be the first to survive the experience if you listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Sarah felt the coffee shop's warmth drain from her body. "What do you mean, survive the experience?" Kellerman's field guide remained open between them, but she could see now that the pages were filled with handwritten notes, sketches that looked disturbingly familiar. Bipedal figures, crude dwellings, organizational structures. Her hands trembled as she finally took the offered chair. The first confirmed footage was captured in 1987 by a Forest Service researcher named Michael Torres, Kellerman said, his voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Fire damage assessment in Olympic National Park." His helicopter crew filmed what they initially reported as illegal logging operations. When they reviewed the footage more carefully, he paused, studying her face. Torres disappeared 3 weeks later. Hiking accident, according to the official report. "You're saying they were killed for—" "I'm saying that certain elements within our government have spent decades maintaining what they call equilibrium status." Kellerman turned a page in his field guide, revealing a detailed map of the Pacific Northwest marked with red X's. "The arrangement is older than you might think. Much older." Sarah stared at the map, counting dozens of marks scattered across remote wilderness areas. "Arrangement?" "They stay hidden. We stay ignorant. And the illusion of human dominance remains intact. It's worked for generations because both sides have honored the terms." His pale eyes fixed on hers. "Until researchers like you started flying drones into territories that were supposed to remain unsurveyed." The implications crashed over her like a physical blow. "The government knows about them, has always known?" "Known, monitored, occasionally negotiated with." The Deep Forest Project was officially disbanded in 2015, but the protocols remain in effect. Any evidence of their existence gets buried, and anyone who captured that evidence. Kellerman shrugged eloquently. Sarah's mind reeled through the events of the morning. Agent Voss's knowing questions, the satellite imagery, the swift response to her discovery. But why? Why maintain the secrecy? Because revelation would destabilize everything. Kellerman leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped around his coffee cup. Imagine the religious implications alone. Indigenous populations who've claimed these beings existed for centuries suddenly vindicated. Archaeological timelines rewritten. Questions about who really has territorial rights to ancestral lands. And that's before you consider the military applications. Military applications? Intelligence that survived in complete secrecy for centuries develops remarkable skills, Dr. Chen. Camouflage, resource management, guerrilla tactics that would make special forces envious. Some people in Washington started wondering what could be learned from studying them more directly. Sarah felt sick. The creatures in her footage, teaching their young, tending crops, creating art, reduced to military assets for extraction and exploitation. That's why they're moving so fast against me. They want to control the evidence before it spreads. Partly. But there's something else. Kellerman's expression darkened. The arrangement has been breaking down for the past 5 years. Climate change has forced them out of traditional territories, increased human presence in remote areas, more sightings, more questions. Some factions in their society have started advocating for direct contact. Direct contact? Think about it from their perspective. They've watched human civilization expand and accelerate for generations, seen us develop technology that could threaten their survival. Some of their younger populations are arguing that continued secrecy is more dangerous than revelation. Sarah thought of the intelligence she'd witnessed in the drone footage, the complex social structures. They're debating whether to reveal themselves. And your footage might be the catalyst that forces their hand. Kellerman closed his field guide and slipped it into his jacket. That's why Voss and her team are so aggressive. They're not just covering up another sighting. They're trying to prevent what could become first contact between two intelligent species. The implications are enormous. Sarah touched her jacket pocket where the drives waited like unexploded ordnance. So what am I supposed to do? Pretend I never saw anything? Let them destroy my career and bury the truth? That would be the safest option for everyone involved, including the beings you filmed. Kellerman's voice carried decades of hard-won experience. But I don't think you're going to choose safety, are you, Dr. Chen? Sarah stared into her untouched coffee, seeing her reflection fragment in the dark surface. 3 hours ago, her biggest concern had been tenure committee politics. Now she sat holding evidence that could rewrite human history, while government agents circled like wolves. You said I might be the first to survive this. What makes me different? Kellerman smiled for the first time, and it transformed his weathered features. Because you're not approaching this as a government asset or a military opportunity. You're seeing them as they actually are, another intelligent species trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast for ancient solutions. He stood, leaving money on the table. The question is, are you willing to risk everything to give both species a chance at something better than the current arrangement? Sarah felt the weight of 2 civilizations balanced on the drives in her pocket, waiting for her answer. Sarah stared at Kellerman's retreating figure through the coffee shop window, watching him disappear into the afternoon crowd with the casual efficiency of someone who'd spent decades avoiding surveillance. The weight of his question pressed against her chest like a physical force. Are you willing to risk everything? Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your house is being searched. Don't go home. K. The coffee cup slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, shattering against the floor in an explosion of ceramic and cold liquid. Around her, conversations continued, the ordinary world spinning on while her life collapsed into something unrecognizable. They were in her house, going through her research, her personal belongings, looking for any trace of evidence she might have hidden. Sarah forced herself to stand on unsteady legs, mumbling apologies to the barista who appeared with a mop. Through the window, she could see the street with new eyes, every parked car a potential surveillance post, every pedestrian a possible agent. The paranoia felt like a living thing crawling beneath her skin. She needed to move, but where? Her office at the university was compromised. Her home was being ransacked. The hotel room she'd used after the initial drone survey would be the next logical place they'd look. Sarah realized with crystalline horror that she was now truly fugitive, carrying evidence that made her a target for forces she couldn't begin to comprehend. The drives in her pocket felt heavier than lead. Everything she'd worked for, her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed academic life, was evaporating like morning mist. But worse than the personal destruction was the growing certainty that she held the fate of an entire civilization in her hands. Beings who had survived in secrecy for centuries, now exposed because she'd chosen the wrong flight path for her drone. Sarah's reflection in the bookshop window showed a woman she barely recognized, wild-eyed, pale, transformed from respected researcher to hunted fugitive in the space of a single morning. The comfortable illusion of safety that academic life provided had been shattered, revealing the brutal machinery that operated beneath civilization's polite surface. Her phone rang. The university's main number. Dr. Chen. Dean Morrison's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering a death sentence. I need you to come in immediately. There are some serious concerns about your recent research activities. What kind of concerns? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Questions about data integrity, possible fabrication of evidence. The tenure committee has asked for an immediate review of all your current projects. Each word fell like a hammer blow. Dr. Chen, I have to ask, have you been experiencing any personal stress lately? Health issues that might affect your judgment? They were building the narrative, the breakdown story. Dr. Sarah Chen, respected wildlife biologist, suffers mysterious mental collapse and begins fabricating evidence of impossible creatures. Her subsequent disappearance would be reframed as the tragic consequence of psychological instability rather than government suppression. I'm fine, Dean Morrison, but I can't come in right now. Sarah, listen to me carefully. There are federal investigators asking very specific questions about your recent fieldwork. Questions that suggest you may have stumbled into something far beyond academic research. If you're in possession of any sensitive materials, the best thing you can do is cooperate fully with the authorities. Even Morrison, her ally for over a decade, was reading from their script now. Sarah felt the last bridge to her old life burning behind her. "I understand," she said quietly. "Tell them I'll be in touch." She hung up and immediately powered off the phone, knowing they could track her location as long as it remained active. The simple act of cutting that connection felt like severing an umbilical cord, leaving her floating in hostile space with no way home. Sarah looked around the coffee shop one final time, memorizing this moment when her old life officially ended. The graduate students hunched over laptops, the professors grading papers, the casual conversations about tenure and publications. All of it belonged to a world she could never re-enter. She was across the threshold now, committed to a path that led into unmapped territory. Outside, the October afternoon carried the scent of coming rain. Sarah walked with no destination, letting her feet choose direction, while her mind grappled with impossible choices. Every step took her further from safety, deeper into a conflict between civilizations that predated her birth. The footage in her pocket represented more than evidence. It was testimony to intelligence that had thrived in shadows, while humanity celebrated its supposed dominance. Those beings had children, culture, art. They had trusted the forest to keep their secrets, and that trust had been violated by her curiosity. Sarah found herself standing at a bus stop, staring at a route map that might as well have been written in hieroglyphs. Wherever she went next, there would be no return to the comfortable certainty of academic life. She was committed now to protecting secrets that could reshape the world or destroy it. The ordeal had truly begun. The Route 12 bus wheezed to a stop in a cloud of diesel exhaust, its hydraulic doors opening with a mechanical sigh that seemed to echo Sarah's resignation. She climbed aboard without looking at the destination sign, paying the fare with trembling fingers, while the driver studied her with the practiced indifference of someone who'd seen every variety of human desperation. Sarah chose a seat near the back, watching familiar neighborhoods blur past the rain-streaked window. The normalcy outside, children walking home from school, elderly couples tending gardens, joggers following their predictable routes, felt like scenes from someone else's life. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, trying to formulate some kind of plan from the wreckage of everything she'd once been. Her phone, though powered off, felt radioactive in her pocket alongside the drives. Every instinct screamed to destroy the evidence, to erase what she'd discovered and attempt to rebuild some semblance of her former existence. But Kellerman's words haunted her. "You might be the first to survive this experience," the implication being that others hadn't. Other researchers, other scientists who'd glimpsed too much truth and paid the ultimate price. The bus shuddered to a stop, and Sarah looked up to find herself in a part of the city she didn't recognize. Run-down strip malls and fast food restaurants bleeding neon into the gathering dusk. She got off without knowing why, driven by some instinct that standing still meant death. Her reflection in a shop window showed someone she barely knew, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled, eyes carrying the hunted look of prey that knows the predator is closing in. Dr. Sarah Chen, respected academic, had been erased as efficiently as her university records. What remained was something unnamed, something that existed in the liminal space between two worlds. Sarah's hands shook as she checked her wallet. $63 in cash, credit cards that could be tracked the moment she used them. She thought of her house, 20 years of careful accumulation, books and research notes and personal belongings that defined her identity. All of it contaminated now, possibly destroyed, certainly lost to her forever. A police cruiser turned the corner, moving slowly, and Sarah felt her heart seize. She ducked into the nearest business, a dingy internet cafe that smelled of energy drinks and desperation. The teenager behind the counter looked up from his phone with mild annoyance. "You using a terminal?" he asked. Sarah nodded, paying $5 for 30 minutes of access. The ancient computer wheezed to life, its screen flickering with the promise of connection to a world that might no longer contain any safe harbor for her. She pulled up a search for her own name, dreading what she might find. The results made her stomach drop through the floor. Dr. Sarah Chen's faculty page had vanished. Her published papers were now attributed to colleagues or listed as collaborative works, where her name appeared nowhere. Her doctoral dissertation, accessible online for 15 years, returned a 404 error. They weren't just destroying her future, they were erasing her past. 23 years of research, hundreds of citations, a carefully built reputation in wildlife biology, all being systematically deleted from human record. It was as if Dr. Sarah Chen had never existed. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she couldn't afford to shed. The drives in her pocket represented the only proof that her life's work had meant anything at all. But they also contained evidence of something that powerful people would kill to suppress, secrets that belonged to beings who had never asked to be discovered. She thought of the footage, mothers teaching their young, elderly figures sharing knowledge, the intricate social structures that spoke of centuries of accumulated wisdom. They had children, families, art, culture. They had trusted the deep forest to protect them, and her curiosity had shattered that ancient compact. A shadow fell across her screen. Sarah looked up to find two men in dark suits standing behind her, their faces carrying the cold professionalism she'd learned to recognize. Her blood turned to ice water. "Dr. Chen," the taller one said quietly. "You've led us quite a chase." The teenager behind the counter had vanished. The internet cafe, which had been almost full when she'd entered, was now empty except for the three of them. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her pocket, toward the drives that represented both salvation and damnation. "Don't," the second agent said. "Just come with us. No one needs to get hurt." Sarah stared at the computer screen where the absence of her life's work glowed like an accusation. Everything she'd been was gone. Her career, her identity, her future, all erased with surgical precision. The beings in the forest would be hunted now because of her discovery, their ancient secrecy, their children, their very existence threatened by her inadvertent betrayal. She had lost everything, and doomed them in the process. The dark moment had arrived, complete and devastating, leaving nothing but the terrible knowledge that her search for truth had destroyed two worlds at once. Sarah's fingers closed around the flash drives in her pocket as she faced the two agents, feeling the weight of their ultimatum settle over her like a burial shroud. The empty internet cafe stretched around them, a sterile tomb where her former life had just finished dying on screen. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "All of you. This whole system of secrecy and suppression." The taller agent's expression didn't change. "Dr. Chen, you're experiencing a severe psychological break. We're here to help you get the treatment you need." Narrative. They'd already written the story. Respected scientist suffers mental collapse, fabricates evidence of impossible creatures, requires immediate psychiatric intervention. Clean, efficient, believable. Sarah felt something crystallize in her chest, a clarity that cut through the fog of terror and despair. "Show me your credentials," she said. The agents exchanged glances. The shorter one reached into his jacket, but Sarah was already talking. "No badges, no introductions, no warrants." She stood slowly, keeping her hands visible. "Because you're not really federal agents, are you? You're something else entirely." The taller man's pale eyes flickered, the first crack in his professional mask. "Ma'am, you need to come with us. Now." But Sarah was seeing it all with devastating clarity. Kellerman's words echoing. Some factions in their society have started advocating for direct contact. The speed of the response to her discovery, the surgical precision with which her identity was being erased, the empty cafe. "You're them," she whispered. "You're part of their civilization." The agents went perfectly still, and in that stillness, Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. Their posture shifted almost imperceptibly, too fluid, too controlled, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of different musculature, different reflexes. When the shorter one tilted his head, listening to something she couldn't hear, The gesture was unmistakably canine. Impossible, Sarah breathed. But even as she said it, she knew she was wrong, not impossible, inevitable. She thought of the complex social structures in her footage, the tool use, the evidence of advanced intelligence. Of course they would have infiltrated human society. Of course they would have agents in government, in military, in the very agencies tasked with covering up their existence. The taller agent, being, smiled, and for an instant his canine seemed too sharp, too prominent. Dr. Sarah Chen, wildlife biologist, specialist in apex predator behavior. 23 years studying hunters without ever realizing she was being studied in return. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her career, her research focus, her inexplicable fascination with predator intelligence, none of it had been her choice. She'd been guided, shaped, aimed like an arrow at this moment. My research positions, the grants that always came through, the opportunities that led me deeper into their territories. Her voice came out hollow, mechanical. You've been orchestrating my career for decades. We needed someone to make the discovery, the being said. Someone with credibility, with the right expertise. Someone who would react exactly as you have reacted. Sarah's legs gave out. She sank back into the plastic chair, understanding flooding through her with the crushing weight of absolute truth. You wanted me to find them. The drone footage, the camp, it was all deliberate. The younger generation of our society grows impatient with secrecy, the shorter being explained, his human disguise wavering around the edges now that the pretense was dropping. They believe the time for hiding is over, but they needed evidence, a human witness whose discovery would force the conversation. And the government cover-up? Also us, different faction, those who believe exposure would mean genocide. The taller being moved closer, his movements now openly predatory. You've become the focal point of a civil war that's been building for decades, Dr. Chen. The question is whether you'll serve as the catalyst for our revelation to humanity, or our final proof that your species cannot be trusted with the truth. Sarah stared at her hands, seeing her entire life recontextualized in an instant. Every major decision, every career move, every research project that had led her deeper into understanding predator behavior, all of it orchestrated by intelligences she'd never suspected existed. She wasn't a scientist who'd stumbled onto a discovery. She was a laboratory rat who'd finally found the maze's end. The drives, she whispered, contain exactly what we wanted them to contain. Evidence compelling enough to convince other humans, undeniable enough to force the conversation we need to have. The being's voice carried something that might have been sympathy. You've played your role perfectly, Dr. Chen. Now we need to decide what happens next. Sarah looked up at faces that wore humanity like masks, finally understanding the true scope of what she'd uncovered. The footage in her pocket wasn't just evidence of their existence. It was a declaration of war between two civilizations, with her unwitting signature at the bottom. The revelation was complete. She had never been the hunter. She had always been the prey. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the hum of failing fluorescent lights above. Sarah stared at the beings wearing human faces, feeling the crushing weight of her manipulated existence settle into her bones. But beneath the devastation, something else began to stir, a fierce anger that burned through the fog of despair. So what now? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. You've proven your point. Humanity's apex predator turns out to be someone's lab rat. Game over. The taller being tilted his head, studying her with eyes that seemed to reflect too much light. That depends entirely on you, Dr. Chen. What do you believe humanity deserves to know? Sarah's hand tightened around the drives. 23 years of her life had been orchestrated, but the rage building in her chest was entirely her own. You want to know what I believe? I believe you made one critical error in your grand experiment. Both beings went still. You assumed that discovering the truth would break me, that finding out I'd been manipulated would make me compliant. Sarah stood slowly, feeling strength flow back into her legs. But you studied predators through me for decades. You should understand that cornering prey doesn't always produce submission. Sometimes it produces something far more dangerous. The shorter being's disguise flickered more noticeably now, his features shifting like heat shimmer. Dr. Chen, you said I've become the focal point of your civil war. Fine. Then let me make something absolutely clear. Sarah's voice cut through the stale air like a blade. I won't be anyone's catalyst. Not for your revelation faction. Not for your secrecy faction. I'm done being a game piece in someone else's strategy. She pulled out her phone, powering it on despite their protests. You want evidence compelling enough to force a conversation? You want to see how humanity reacts to the truth? Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to contact every major news outlet, every scientific journal, every social media platform I can access. Your carefully controlled revelation just became a flood. The taller being moved toward her with fluid grace. That would be unwise, would it? Sarah backed toward the rear exit, phone already connecting to the internet. Your secrecy faction thinks exposure means genocide. Your revelation faction wants careful, controlled disclosure. But maybe what both sides need to understand is that this isn't your choice to make anymore. Her fingers flew across the screen, uploading files to cloud storage, sending emails to journalists she'd known for years. The beings watched with expressions that seemed genuinely uncertain, perhaps the first honest emotion she'd seen from them. You're forcing our hand, the shorter one said. Good. Because here's what your experiment actually proved. Not that humanity can't be trusted with truth, but that no species, no matter how intelligent, has the right to manipulate another's evolution in secret. The uploads completed. Sarah felt a surge of savage satisfaction as confirmation emails began flooding her inbox. The taller being's composure cracked completely. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. You don't understand the consequences. I understand them perfectly. Chaos, fear, possibly violence, but also the chance for both our species to make real choices based on actual truth instead of carefully crafted illusions. Sarah reached the back door, her hand on the handle. You turned me into a weapon for your civil war. Now you get to live with what I choose to target. The beings exchanged glances, some form of rapid communication passing between them. When they looked back at her, something fundamental had shifted in their demeanor. The revelation faction will protect you, the shorter one said. The evidence needs a credible spokesperson, and the secrecy faction will try to stop you permanently. Sarah felt a grim smile cross her face. Then I guess we're about to find out which side really understands human nature. Because the one thing you never accounted for in all your careful manipulation is this. Predators recognize other predators. And now that I know what you are, I know what I need to become. She pushed through the door into the alley behind the cafe, phone already ringing with callbacks from news organizations. The cool evening air hit her face like baptism, washing away the last traces of Dr. Sarah Chen, respected academic and unwitting pawn. What emerged from that alley was something new. A woman who had been forged in deception but tempered by truth, carrying evidence that would reshape two worlds, whether those worlds were ready or not. Behind her, she heard one of the beings speaking into some kind of communication device, words in a language that predated human civilization. The real war was about to begin, and Sarah Chen, whatever she was now, intended to survive it. Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly as she moved through the narrow alley, notifications cascading across the screen like digital artillery. CNN, BBC, Reuters, The Washington Post, academic journals, wildlife organizations. Her carefully crafted uploads were already spreading through the network of contacts she'd built over 2 decades, each share multiplying the reach exponentially. The cool evening air carried the scent of impending rain, but also something else. The distinctive musk she'd learned to associate with her hunters. They were following, multiple signatures moving with coordinated precision through the urban landscape. Sarah quickened her pace, ducking under fire escapes and around dumpsters, her mind calculating routes with a clarity that surprised her. 23 years of studying apex predators, had taught her more than she'd realized, not just how they hunted, but how prey survived. The successful ones didn't run blindly. They used terrain, misdirection, unpredictability. They turned the hunters' advantages against them. Her phone rang. A producer from 60 Minutes, voice tight with professional excitement tinged by disbelief. "Dr. Chen? We received your files. If this is authentic—" "It's authentic," Sarah said, cutting between parked cars onto a main street bright with traffic and witnesses. "But I need protection. There are forces moving to suppress this story that you can't imagine. We're sending a crew to meet you. Can you get to the Westin downtown?" Sarah almost laughed at the naivety. A hotel room would be a tomb, surrounded and sanitized within hours. No, somewhere public. The Pike Place Market. 1 hour. She ended the call before the producer could object, then immediately dialed her next contact. Every conversation, every interview scheduled, every platform activated was another anchor point in reality. They could erase Dr. Sarah Chen from academic records, but they couldn't delete her from the living memory of dozens of journalists simultaneously. The street ahead opened into a wider thoroughfare, and Sarah felt momentarily safer among the evening crowds. But her relief was short-lived. A figure emerged from an alley 50 yards ahead, humanoid but wrong somehow, moving with that same fluid grace she'd witnessed in the cafe. Then another, stepping out from behind a bus stop. A third, emerging from the entrance of an office building. They were herding her. Sarah's enhanced awareness catalogued every detail, the subtle ways they communicated through gesture and posture, the coordinated timing of their movements, the careful positioning that funneled her toward a less populated side street. Predator behavior, executed with the precision of a species that had perfected pack hunting over millennia. But Sarah had advantages they hadn't accounted for. She understood their tactics because she'd spent decades studying their equivalents in the wild. More importantly, she was no longer the same woman who'd stumbled onto their secret 3 days ago. That person had been shaped by their manipulation, guided by their hidden influence. What remained was something raw, more adaptable. She ducked into a busy restaurant, weaving between tables toward the kitchen. Surprised staff called out protests, but Sarah was already through the back entrance, emerging onto a loading dock that connected to an entirely different block. Behind her, she heard the controlled commotion of her pursuers, realizing they'd lost the scent. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop running. You're only making this harder." Sarah typed back, "Which faction are you? Because my next interview starts in 40 minutes, and I'm very curious to hear your perspective on camera." No response. The Pike Place Market was perfect. Too many people, too many cameras, too much chaos for a clean extraction. Sarah positioned herself at the center of the main concourse, back to the fish-throwing vendors, surrounded by tourists and their smartphones. When the 60 Minutes crew arrived, their professional equipment would add another layer of protection. But as she waited, scanning the crowd for familiar faces or subtle predatory movements, Sarah felt the full weight of what she'd initiated. Her uploads were already generating responses, skeptical scientists demanding authentication, cryptozoologists claiming vindication, government agencies no doubt scrambling to contain the narrative. Soon, very soon, the existence of an advanced non-human civilization would become public knowledge. Revelation faction would get their exposure, but not on their terms. The secrecy faction would face their worst nightmare, and humanity would confront the terrifying reality that they'd never been alone, never been apex, never been in control of their own development. Sarah Chen had started this journey as an unwitting pawn in someone else's game. But standing in the heart of human chaos and commerce, surrounded by the species she was about to shock into a new reality, she realized she'd become something unprecedented. The first human to consciously declare war on puppet masters who'd remained hidden for centuries. The final confrontation wasn't approaching. She'd already initiated it. Now came the truly dangerous part, surviving what she'd unleashed long enough to see which world would emerge from the collision. Her phone rang. The next interview was beginning. Sarah answered the call as camera crews converged on her position, their professional equipment creating a fortress of accountability around her. The 60 Minutes producer was breathless, urgent. "Dr. Chen, We're going live in 30 seconds. Whatever's on those drives will change everything, Sarah finished, watching familiar figures emerge from the crowd. Not her pursuers this time, but something worse. Humans, real ones. Government officials with badges that would scan as authentic, warrants that would hold up under scrutiny, authority that could override any journalist's protests. The secrecy faction had adapted faster than she'd anticipated. Dr. Sarah Chen called a woman in a crisp federal suit, flanked by 6 agents. "I'm Deputy Director Morrison, Department of Homeland Security. You need to come with us immediately. National security matter." The cameras were already rolling, live streams broadcasting to thousands. Sarah felt the weight of the moment crystallizing around her. Every decision from here would be recorded, disseminated, impossible to erase. This was the test she'd unknowingly trained for her entire career, how to survive when every predator in the ecosystem finally revealed itself. "On whose authority?" Sarah called back, projecting her voice to carry to the microphones. "And what exactly constitutes the national security threat? My research, or what my research revealed?" Deputy Director Morrison's expression tightened. Behind her, Sarah caught glimpses of the other hunters, the beings wearing human faces, watching from the crowd's periphery. Both factions were here, she realized, waiting to see which side would claim victory, which narrative would emerge from the chaos she'd created. "Dr. Chen, you're in possession of classified materials that could destabilize international relations. This isn't a request." Sarah felt something shift inside her, not fear, but a predatory clarity she'd never experienced before. 23 years of studying how apex species dominated ecosystems had taught her that true power lay not in force, but in understanding the system better than anyone else. She finally saw the complete picture, the centuries-old secret, the faction war, the human government caught between forces they didn't comprehend, and herself at the fulcrum point where all pressures converged. "Classified by whom?" she asked, stepping closer to the cameras. "Because 3 days ago I was Dr. Sarah Chen, respected wildlife biologist with full security clearance. Then I made a discovery, and suddenly my entire academic identity was erased from every database. My PhD revoked, my research attributed to others. So I'm curious, Deputy Director, who exactly has the authority to classify evidence of a non-human civilization that's been manipulating human development for centuries?" Morrison went pale. Around them, the crowd was growing larger, drawn by the spectacle of federal agents confronting scientists surrounded by news crews. Smartphones captured every word, broadcasting Sarah's accusations to an audience that was doubling every minute. "You're talking about conspiracy theories." "I'm talking about footage," Sarah interrupted, holding up the drives. "Authenticated evidence of an advanced settlement in the Olympic Peninsula. Tool use, agriculture, complex social structures. Beings that have been living alongside humanity while remaining completely hidden from our historical record. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is why you're so desperate to keep that truth buried." In the crowd, Sarah spotted them. The beings she'd first encountered as fake federal agents, their disguises now perfect under scrutiny, but their positioning betraying their non-human origins. They were communicating somehow, rapid, silent coordination that spoke of species-level planning beyond anything human government could match. The real test wasn't surviving the government's attempts to silence her. It was navigating the war between 2 alien factions, while maintaining human agency in a conflict that treated her species as either livestock or obstacles. "Dr. Chen," Morrison said, stepping forward with handcuffs visible, "I'm placing you under arrest for violations of the Espionage Act." But Sarah was already moving, not away from the agents but toward them, closing distance with the fluid grace she'd learned from studying predators. "Go ahead. Arrest me on live television for revealing evidence of non-human intelligence. Make it official government policy that contact with other civilizations is a federal crime. See how well that plays with voters who are watching their screens right now, seeing video of creatures that couldn't possibly be human, using tools that predate our civilization." She thrust one of the drives toward the nearest camera. The footage is already uploaded to 17 different platforms. Arresting me doesn't contain this anymore. It just confirms that everything I'm saying is true. Morrison hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sarah saw her opening. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about seizing control of a narrative that had been manipulated for centuries, forcing both human and non-human players to respond to choices made by someone who refused to be anyone's pawn. The final test had begun, and Sarah Chen intended to rewrite the rules entirely. The moment stretched like a held breath before a lightning strike. Sarah could feel the weight of every gaze, human and otherwise, focused on her small figure at the center of Pike Place Market. Morrison's hand hovered over her service weapon while federal agents shifted into formation, but their movements seemed suddenly clumsy compared to the fluid repositioning of the beings hidden throughout the crowd. Then the choice was made for everyone. A sound erupted from the northern edge of the market, not quite human, not quite animal, but something that bypassed rational thought and triggered every survival instinct humanity had evolved. Screams followed as a figure burst through the crowd, no longer bothering with its human disguise. 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light, moving with impossible speed toward Sarah's position. "Secrecy faction," she breathed, recognizing the coordinated aggression she'd witnessed in her drone footage. They'd decided that direct action was preferable to watching their millennia-old secret dissolve in real time on social media. Morrison spun toward the new threat, her weapon clearing its holster with professional efficiency. But Sarah was already in motion. Not fleeing, she'd learned too much about predator behavior to turn her back on an active hunt. Instead, she dove toward the nearest camera crew, using their equipment and bodies as both shield and anchor point. Whatever happened next would be recorded, broadcast, impossible to deny or erase. The creature reached Morrison first. Sarah caught a glimpse of elongated limbs, hands that ended in claws designed for tearing, intelligence, burning in eyes that held no trace of humanity. The deputy director got off 2 shots before those claws found their mark, sending her sprawling across the concrete in a spreading pool of crimson. Chaos exploded outward from that point of contact. Federal agents opened fire while civilians fled in every direction, their screams mixing with the inhuman sounds of more creatures emerging from concealment. But these weren't random attacks. Sarah could see the pattern, the careful coordination designed to eliminate specific targets while driving the crowd toward predetermined exit points. "They're herding us," she shouted to the cameraman beside her, but her words were lost in the din of gunfire and terror. She pressed herself against an overturned vendor stall, mind racing through everything she'd learned about pack-hunting strategies. The secrecy faction wasn't just trying to silence her. They were staging a massacre that would be attributed to terrorist attack, mass shooting, anything but the truth of what humanity was actually facing. A new sound cut through the chaos, different vocalizations, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones. The Revelation faction had arrived. What followed defied everything Sarah thought she understood about the careful manipulation both sides had maintained for centuries. Beings that had hidden among humans for millennia abandoned all pretense, engaging in open warfare across one of the most public spaces in America. Creatures moved with lethal grace between vendor stalls and tourist attractions, their conflict playing out in full view of hundreds of cameras that continued recording even as their operators fled or fell. Sarah found herself in the eye of the storm, protected by some unspoken agreement between the factions that she represented too valuable a prize to lose to collateral damage. But that protection came with a price. She could see it in the way both sides maneuvered, trying to gain position not just against each other, but around her. The civil war she'd inadvertently sparked was being fought for the right to claim her as spokesperson, symbol, or trophy. "Dr. Chen!" The voice belonged to one of her original contacts from the Revelation faction, but the being speaking bore no resemblance to the carefully crafted human disguise she remembered. This was something older than human civilization, its form shifting between states that hurt to look at directly. "You must choose. Protection or truth, but not both." Sarah felt the fundamental choice crystallizing around her. accept the Revelation faction's guardianship, and become their controlled spokesperson for managed disclosure. Fight both sides and likely die in the crossfire, or find a third option that nobody had considered. She stood up from behind the vendor stall, stepping into the open space where projectiles and claws carved deadly patterns through the air. Her voice, trained by decades of lecturing to skeptical academics, carried over the sound of battle. Stop. The single word shouldn't have penetrated the chaos, but something in her tone, the authority of a predator claiming territory, caused both factions to pause. In that moment of suspension, Sarah walked deliberately to the center of the combat zone, directly under the largest cluster of recording devices. "You want to know the truth," she called out to the cameras, to the world watching in real time as their understanding of reality collapsed. "The truth is that humanity never climbed to the top of the food chain. We were placed there, managed, cultivated, and now our shepherds are fighting over whether we deserve to know we were never free." The pause shattered as both factions lunged toward her simultaneously, but Sarah Chen was no longer the same woman who had launched a research drone 3 days ago. She had become something unprecedented, the first human to consciously step outside a game that had been played for millennia, forcing every player to confront what happened when the pawns refused to stay on the board. The real confrontation had finally begun. The creatures converged on her position with predatory precision, but Sarah didn't flinch. In the split second before claws and inhuman hands reached her, she made the choice that would cost her everything she'd ever been. She activated the dead man's switch on her phone. The device had been rigged during her frantic preparation in the hotel room, a simple program that would execute if her biometrics flatlined or if she failed to input a code every 12 hours. But Sarah triggered it deliberately, watching the screen flash confirmation as terabytes of data began broadcasting simultaneously to every major news network, social media platform, and government database she'd managed to penetrate. Not just the drone footage, everything. Her complete analysis of the settlement's infrastructure. Linguistic patterns decoded from intercepted communications. Genetic samples that proved these beings predated human evolution. Historical documents she'd uncovered showing centuries of manipulation. Wars started and ended, civilizations risen and fallen, all guided by invisible hands that had shaped humanity's development like farmers tending livestock. "You wanted managed disclosure?" she shouted as claws closed around her arms, lifting her off the ground. "Here's unmanaged truth." The being holding her, Revelation faction, she noted with clinical detachment, let out a sound of rage that made every car alarm in the market begin wailing. Around them, both sides froze as the implications hit. Sarah had just made their entire conflict irrelevant. There would be no controlled narrative, no careful introduction of humanity to its true position in the cosmic hierarchy. She had detonated the secret like a nuclear weapon, and the fallout would reshape everything. "You don't understand what you've done," the creature snarled, its voice carrying harmonics that bypassed her ears and vibrated directly through her bones. "Your species isn't ready. The shock will kill some of us," Sarah finished, tasting blood where its claws had punctured her shoulder. "Drive others insane, collapse governments, destroy religions, end the world as we know it." "Yes, I understand perfectly." The secrecy faction members had gone perfectly still, their attention no longer on their ancient enemies, but on the dozens of live streams broadcasting their true forms to millions of viewers worldwide. Sarah could see the exact moment they realized their millennia-old masquerade was over. No amount of disinformation or evidence suppression could undo what was already spreading through humanity's interconnected, nervous system of digital communication. "But here's what neither of you understood," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger despite the pain. "You've been so focused on managing us that you forgot what happens when apex predators are cornered. We adapt. We evolve. We become something you can't control." She felt something shift inside her as she spoke, not physical but deeper, a fundamental alteration in how she perceived herself in relation to everything around her. The woman who had stumbled onto their secret 3 days ago had been shaped by their hidden influence, guided by assumptions they had carefully cultivated over centuries. That person was gone, sacrificed on the altar of truth. What remained was the first human to see the cage clearly and choose to break it, even knowing the cost. Humanity will fall apart, the secrecy faction leader said, its disguise finally dropping to reveal something that might have been beautiful if it hadn't been so utterly alien. Civilization will collapse. Billions will die in the chaos. Sarah nodded, feeling strangely peaceful despite the claws piercing her flesh and the blood pooling beneath her feet. Some will, others will survive, and those survivors will be something neither of your factions planned for, a species that knows exactly what it is, where it came from, and who's been pulling the strings. Around them, the market had emptied except for the scattered dead and the recording equipment that continued broadcasting their conversation to a world in the first stages of complete paradigm shift. Sarah could imagine the scenes playing out across the globe, emergency sessions of world leaders, mass panic in some cities, spontaneous celebrations in others as conspiracy theorists found themselves vindicated beyond their wildest theories. The price of her victory was already becoming clear. Not just her own life, which was forfeit the moment she'd chosen truth over survival, but the stable world she was destroying. 7 billion humans would have to confront the reality that their entire history had been guided by forces they'd never suspected existed. Some would adapt, many wouldn't. But that choice had never really been hers to make. It had been stolen from humanity centuries ago by creatures who decided that a managed species was preferable to a free one. Sarah had simply returned agency to her own kind, whatever the consequences. The claws tightened around her, and she felt her ribs beginning to crack under the pressure. But her phone continued broadcasting, carrying humanity's first glimpse of its true place in a universe far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The sacrifice was complete. What emerged from the ashes would no longer be the carefully cultivated human civilization that these beings had shaped for their own purposes. It would be something unprecedented, a species that chose its own evolution, no matter how much it hurt. Sarah felt the moment her ribs snapped, a wet, grinding sensation that sent white-hot pain through her chest. But the claws that should have finished crushing the life from her body suddenly went slack. Around her, both factions had frozen in a tableau of violence suspended, their attention drawn to something that made even these ancient beings pause in uncertainty. The sound of her phone, still broadcasting from the blood-soaked concrete, had changed. What had been the steady hum of data transmission was now punctuated by incoming alerts, thousands of them, cascading in an electronic symphony that spoke of a world in the first stages of complete transformation. Sarah collapsed to her knees as the Revelation faction leader released her, gasping through what felt like glass shards in her lungs. But she forced herself to crawl toward the device, toward the window that showed her what she'd unleashed upon humanity. The footage was everywhere. Not just the drone recordings, but new videos being uploaded by the second, shaky smartphone captures of the battle in Pike Place Market, enhanced and analyzed frames showing creatures in their true forms, emergency broadcasts from news networks struggling to process information that shattered every assumption about reality. The hashtag #NotHuman was trending globally, accompanied by a flood of corroborating evidence as people around the world suddenly found explanations for things they'd witnessed but never understood. "Look at it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible through the blood filling her throat. But somehow, in the strange acoustics of the devastated market, every being present could hear her. "Look how fast they're adapting." The Revelation faction leader, its careful human disguise completely abandoned now, moved with fluid grace to study the phone's screen. Sarah watched expressions she couldn't interpret play across features that hurt to look at directly. This is unprecedented. The integration rate should be causing mass psychological breakdown. But it isn't, Sarah observed, watching live feeds from major cities where crowds had gathered not in panic, but in something approaching celebration. "You spent so long managing us that you forgot what we actually are underneath all your careful cultivation." We're survivors, adapters, the same species that colonized every continent on Earth before you ever made contact. The secrecy faction members remained motionless, but Sarah could sense their attention focused on the streams of data flowing past. Emergency government sessions where officials struggled to formulate responses to constituents who were demanding answers about cover-ups that went back centuries. Religious leaders grappling with cosmologies that no longer made sense. Scientists around the world abandoning their carefully structured research to pursue questions that had been forbidden just hours ago. Some are breaking. One of the secrecy faction finally spoke, its voice carrying undertones of something that might have been satisfaction. Mental hospitals reporting increased admissions, suicide hotlines overwhelmed. 3 governments have already declared martial law. Sarah nodded, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through her crushed chest. The weak points are failing. They always do during evolutionary pressure. But watch the adaptation curves. She managed to swipe to a different feed. Sociologists and psychologists already conducting real-time analysis of humanity's response to the revelation. The numbers painted a picture that neither faction had predicted. Yes, there was chaos, breakdown, systems failing under the weight of paradigm shift. But there was also something else. Rapid organization, new networks forming, humans finding each other and beginning to ask not just what the truth meant, but what they were going to do about it. 23% integration rate within the first 6 hours, Sarah read from the scrolling data. Tasting copper with every word. Higher in populations with existing conspiracy theory frameworks, but spreading across all demographics. You're witnessing the first consciously directed evolution in human history. The creatures around her exchanged communications in frequencies that made her bones ache, but their body language spoke of something unprecedented in their ancient experience: uncertainty. For millennia, they had shaped human development with the confidence of gardeners tending predictable crops, but Sarah had introduced a variable they'd never planned for, a species suddenly aware of its own manipulation and choosing its response rather than having that response managed for them. "What happens now?" the Revelation faction leader asked, and Sarah realized with dark satisfaction that the question was directed at her, not their own kind. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a wet cough that painted the concrete with fresh red. Now you find out what humanity looks like when we're not performing for your benefit, when we know exactly who's been watching us, studying us, deciding what we're allowed to become. The phone continued its electronic symphony of alerts, each notification representing another crack in the cage that had constrained human development for centuries. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling her heartbeat growing irregular as blood pooled in her lungs. The immediate conflict was over. The truth was free, spreading through humanity's nervous system faster than any attempt to contain it. What came next would be determined not by ancient factions with their careful plans, but by 7 billion humans who finally understood exactly what they were choosing to evolve into. Sarah Chen had kept her promise. She'd returned agency to her species. The rest was up to them. The first thing Sarah noticed when consciousness returned was the absence of pain. Not the dull ache of healing, but complete absence, as if the broken ribs and punctured lungs had been edited out of her body's reality. She lay in what appeared to be a medical facility, though the equipment surrounding her bed followed no human design philosophy she recognized. "You're awake." The voice belonged to Dr. Elena Vasquez, her former research partner, but the woman sitting beside the bed bore only surface resemblance to the colleague Sarah remembered. Elena's eyes held depths that seemed to reflect more years than any human lifetime should contain. "How long?" Sarah's voice emerged clear and strong, another impossibility that she filed away for later analysis. 3 weeks. Though time works differently now that the barriers are down. Elena gestured toward a window that revealed a landscape Sarah almost recognized, the Cascade foothills, but changed. Structures that blended organic curves with geometric precision dotted the valleys between familiar peaks. Humanity adapted faster than anyone predicted, even faster than you hoped. Sarah sat up, marveling at the ease of movement. Her body felt fundamentally altered, Not damaged and repaired, but rebuilt according to specifications she didn't yet understand. The integration rate? 87% global acceptance within the first week. The remaining 13% split between breakdown and aggressive denial. Elena's smile carried sadness alongside something that might have been pride. 3 billion humans volunteering for conscious evolution programs, both factions completely overwhelmed by the response. Through the window, Sarah watched something that defied her previous understanding of possibility. Humans and the beings she'd learned to call the shepherds, working together on construction projects that seemed to reshape reality as much as landscape. The careful hierarchies of predator and managed species had collapsed into something unprecedented, genuine collaboration between intelligences that had been separated by deception for millennia. "The Revelation faction?" Sarah asked. "Disbanded. Their entire purpose was managing disclosure that's now complete. Most have integrated into the new collaborative structures. Some withdrew to their ancient territories to process the change." Elena leaned forward, her expression growing more complex. "The secrecy faction fought longer, but you can't maintain concealment when your hidden presence is being live-streamed by millions of humans with smartphones." Sarah rose from the bed and moved to the window, her reflection showing subtle changes that spoke of more than medical intervention. Her eyes held flecks of colors that didn't exist in human genetics. Her movements carried fluid precision that reminded her uncomfortably of how the shepherds had moved through Pike Place Market. "What did you do to me?" "Nothing you didn't choose." Elena joined her at the window, and Sarah noticed similar alterations in her colleague's appearance. "Recovery from your injuries required intervention that was significant. But the modifications that followed were your decision. You made them while unconscious, but your neural patterns showed clear consent." The landscape below revealed more details as Sarah studied it. Humans working alongside beings whose true forms no longer required disguise. Children, human children, playing games that incorporated abilities she was only beginning to recognize in herself. Agricultural projects that seemed to coax impossible yields from soil that glowed with faint bioluminescence. "I remember dying," Sarah said quietly. "I remember choosing to die. You did choose that, but humanity chose differently for you." Elena's voice carried the weight of species-wide decision. The woman who gave them conscious evolution couldn't be allowed to miss witnessing what she'd made possible. 7 billion people demanding your survival tends to motivate unprecedented cooperation. Sarah felt the truth of it in her altered bones, not just medical intervention, but something deeper. Her consciousness had been preserved and returned to a body rebuilt according to plans that incorporated the best of human and shepherd biology. She was no longer entirely the species she'd fought to liberate, but she wasn't something other than human either. She had become the first example of what humanity was choosing to evolve into. "My family?" The question emerged before she could stop it, carrying decades of complicated love and careful distance. "Waiting. Your sister's been here every day. Your nephew started college early, xenobiology program at the new integrated university." Elena's smile grew warmer. "They're proud of you. Terrified, but proud." Through the window, Sarah watched a group of children, some human, some clearly other, some beautifully mixed, engaged in what appeared to be teaching each other languages that required new vocal structures to speak properly. The sight should have been alien, disturbing. Instead, it felt like watching a promise being kept. She had returned to her world, but the world itself had chosen transformation rather than preservation. Humanity hadn't just learned the truth about their managed evolution. They had seized control of their own development with the enthusiastic chaos that had always defined their species. Sarah Chen had died to give them that choice. The being she had become would live to witness what they built with it. The future, for the first time in millennia, belonged to no one's careful plans. It would be genuinely unprecedented. She found that prospect terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The new beginning. 6 months later, Sarah stood in what had once been the University of Washington's biology department, watching her nephew present his research to an audience that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Marcus, Barely 19, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd grown up during humanity's most dramatic evolutionary leap, gestured enthusiastically toward holographic displays showing symbiotic neural networks between human and shepherd consciousness. "The integration isn't replacement," he explained to the mixed crowd of human academics and beings, whose true forms still made Sarah's enhanced vision struggle to process completely. "It's collaborative evolution, each species maintaining core identity while accessing expanded capabilities through voluntary neural bridging." Sarah felt a familiar swell of pride, complicated now by her awareness of how much her own transformation had influenced his chosen field. Marcus had been 12 when she disappeared into the Cascade forest with her drones. He was finishing his second year of xenobiology studies in humanity's first truly integrated educational system. "Aunt Sarah designed the initial protocols," Marcus continued, and Sarah noticed how easily he referred to her new status. Not the aunt who died in Pike Place Market, but the hybrid being she'd become, first of her kind, bridge between what humanity had been and what it was choosing to become. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared beside her, moving with the fluid silence that marked those who'd undergone similar transformations. "He's impressive. Your sister did well raising him during the transition period." Sarah nodded, remembering those first chaotic weeks when Jennifer had needed to explain to a 12-year-old why his aunt had become international news, then died on live stream, then somehow returned as something not entirely human anymore. The conversation had reportedly gone better than expected. Children, it turned out, adapted to paradigm shifts with remarkable resilience. "The integration centers are reporting 94% success rates now," Elena continued, referring to the facilities where humans could undergo varying degrees of conscious evolution. "The early volunteers helped us refine the protocols significantly." Through the lecture hall's windows, Sarah could see the transformed Seattle skyline. Towers that grew rather than being built, their living walls filtering air while generating the energy needed to maintain the delicate technology that supported 8 million human and shepherd inhabitants. The city had become a proof of concept for what civilization could look like when two species collaborated, instead of one managing the other, in secret. Not every integration had gone smoothly. The 13% of humanity that had rejected the revelation entirely had established isolated communities, some friendly, others militantly opposed to what they viewed as contamination of human genetic integrity. 3 small wars had erupted and been contained through methods that required cooperation between human military strategists and shepherd capabilities that defied conventional physics. But the majority had embraced change with the adaptive enthusiasm that had always defined their species. Voluntary evolution programs had waiting lists stretching years into the future, new universities focused on previously forbidden research areas, art forms that incorporated sensory ranges unknown to baseline humans, political systems attempting to balance the needs of beings with radically different lifespans and thought processes. Marcus finished his presentation to enthusiastic feedback from professors whose own research had been transformed by access to shepherd knowledge. Sarah watched him field questions about neural plasticity and consciousness bridges with the casual expertise of someone who'd grown up thinking such topics were normal dinner conversation. "He wants to study advanced integration protocols," Elena mentioned. "Following your path, essentially. Pushing the boundaries of how far human consciousness can expand while maintaining core identity." Sarah felt a complex mix of pride and concern. Her own transformation had been born of necessity, death offering the only path to survival. But Marcus represented something different, humanity's first generation to view conscious evolution not as emergency intervention, but as natural progression. "The risk factors?" she asked. "Lower each year." The early volunteers provided crucial data about neural tolerance limits and consciousness preservation during major biological modification. Elena's expression grew thoughtful, though some changes remain irreversible. "You understand that better than anyone." Sarah touched her reflection in the window glass, noting features that shifted subtly depending on lighting and viewing angle. She remained recognizably herself, but self had expanded to encompass possibilities that baseline humanity couldn't access. Enhanced sensory processing that revealed layers of reality previously invisible. Cognitive frameworks that could interface directly with Shepherd knowledge systems. Physical capabilities that bordered on fantasy. The trade-offs were real. Baseline human food tasted like ash. She required technological supplements to sleep properly. Social connections with unmodified humans felt distant, filtered through awareness of biological differences that created subtle barriers to understanding. But watching Marcus present research that pushed the boundaries of consciousness itself, seeing Jennifer adapt to raising a teenager in a world where genetic modification centers advertised alongside grocery stores, observing humanity embrace its first consciously directed evolutionary leap with characteristic chaos and determination, Sarah found the costs acceptable. She had died to give her species agency over its own development. What they built with that freedom would define not just humanity's future, but serve as proof that intelligence could choose cooperation over domination, growth over control. The future remained genuinely unprecedented. Sarah Chen, first bridge between what humanity had been and what it was becoming, would help them write it. Outside, children played games that required abilities from both species to master, their laughter carrying harmonics impossible for baseline human vocal cords to produce. It sounded like hope.